Hello, Art 550. Welcome to Group 4's presentation about Neo-Dada, New Realism, and Pop Art by Dominique Santos, Laura Schock, Lori Wolnick, and Yvonne Kasic. We're going to start by giving you a quick rundown on each of these movements, starting with Neo-Dada. The Neo-Dada movement was an exploration of the relationship between art and ordinary life. Robert Rauschenberg said, "Painting relates to both art and life. Neither can be made." He said, "I tried to act in the gap between the two." Likewise, John Cage, who was an influential member of the Neo-Dada movement, said that there should be a blurring of the distinction between art and life. So you can see that art and life share a close relationship. These artists often worked with collage, assemblage, and also found objects. And some of the famous artists from this group include Robert Rauschenberg, who is known for his combines, as you can see her on the right, and then also Jasper Johns, who uses familiar imagery like targets and the American flag in his work. Next, we have the Nouveau Réalisme, or New Realism movement. This was a European movement that was similar to Neo-Dada in its goals to connect art and life. They were really seeking to narrow the gap between art and life and bring art to a more approachable level. They found a lot of inspiration in urban life. Yves Klein is one of the most famous members from this group. He is one of the founders, and he is known for his monochrome paintings, particularly his use of this intense, deep, velvety blue known as International Klein Blue, that he actually worked with someone to develop and patented, making him the first artist to actually patent a color, bringing to mind the current artist, the contemporary artist Anish Kapoor. And a fun fact about that International Klein Blue is that it's actually used by the Blue Man Group. Some other famous artists from this group are Raymond Hines, Jacques de la Villeglay, and Mimo Rotella, who invented this technique of décollage, where they would incorporate used, torn street posters into their work. Next, we have Jean Tinguely, who is an artist who made kinetic machines. And then lastly, we have Christo, who was later joined by his wife, and his work began with found object and assemblage art that included wrapping objects, and then it progressed to something more large scale, to what he's known for today, which is wrapping monuments or nature, working with his environment to create these large-scale sculptures. Lastly, we have the pop art movement. And pop art also made connections with ordinary life. It was supposed to be, if you might remember from the book, them calling it a more inclusive art. The European pop artist Richard Hamilton said pop art should be low cost, designed for a mass audience, aimed at youth, and should emulate big business. They made connections to daily life by the imagery that they used. So they would use images from advertisements, comic books, and reference mundane cultural objects. One of the most famous members of the pop art movement is Andy Warhol, and he used a variety of media, but he's probably best known for his Campbell's soup cans and his silkscreen images like that of Marilyn Monroe, which we're going to talk about a little bit later in this presentation. Also is Roy Lichtenstein. He used this comic strip style art and Ben-Day dots in his work. And we also have David Hockney, who is a British artist. He uses a variety of media. Something I'm particularly fond of is his photography that explores the ideas of Cubism, but he also experimented with painting. And then lastly, we have Claes Oldenburg, who has also a wide range of work that spans several movements, including abstract expressionism. And he is known for his fabric and plaster food constructions, as well as his large-scale sculptures of everyday objects. So how did these movements come about? They definitely were inspired and influenced by some of the artists that went before them. First of all, they were inspired by the Dada movement, and that can be seen in their media, their use of collage and assemblage, and also the use of real objects in their work that really harkens back to Duchamp's ready-mades. Also, they were influenced by abstract expressionism, which paved the way for future art. It really put America on the map as an epicenter of art and also of the avant-garde movement. The American artists of the abstract expressionism helped to elevate art, the American art, to the status of high art. Jackson Pollock in particular was an influence. You might remember from the Capra reading that he says the random play of the hand upon the canvas or paper has become increasingly important. Strokes, smears, lines, dots become less and less attached to represented objects and existed more and more on their own self-sufficiency. Willem de Kooning was another big source of inspiration. His women series utilized collage with familiar images that really inspired pop artists. The artist of this time felt like he was very accessible. He straddled the two worlds between European tradition and American avant-gardism, and they really admired the methods with which he worked. Another influence was post-war America. At this time, America really was increasing in wealth and power, and we also had the GI Bill that offered grants that made it financially possible for youth to study what they wanted, and that included artists. American art critics were influential as they facilitated these movements. They really helped to generate new ideas and also to promote these artists. And then lastly, I mentioned earlier John Cage, who was a musician. He was very much into the Dada movement, and he was also into Zen Buddhism, which gave him this more positive spin. He helped put a more positive spin on post-war Dada. In the years that followed World War II, there was a boom in production in the US and also in Europe. The works from these groups can be seen as commentaries or allegories on capitalist consumerism. Oftentimes, they are simultaneously expressing a fascination and also a disgust with consumerism. Robert Rauschenberg, who is part of that Neo-Dada movement, his work is oftentimes seen as a commentary on consumer society and our fascination with newness. He incorporated junk into his works, kind of referencing this idea of the obsolescence of objects. And perhaps you've heard of planned obsolescence, which is an idea that was born in the 1930s as a potential way to end the Depression because it would encourage consumers to buy more, and it's something that took off after World War II. The New Realist movement, they were fascinated with this idea of the new reality that surrounded them, this urban consumer society that they saw in Europe. Tanguy, his kinetic sculptures were often useless, or in the case of his work Homage to New York, it's self-destructed, which is much like the mass-produced objects of that time. Pop art used recognizable images from consumer culture as a critique of society. So, for example, we have Andy Warhol soup cans, of course, and also even just the use of that silk screening process that repeated multiples of an image that really spoke about the technology of the time. An excellent example of how pop art responded to capitalist consumerism is the work of the British pop artist Richard Hamilton. His piece that you see here, Just What Is It That Makes Today's Home So Different, So Appealing? This collage is filled with iconic imagery from American consumer culture, such as the Tootsie Pop. We also see canned ham, a television, a tape recorder, a Ford advertisement, amongst other things. And even the choice for his ceiling, he used a moon, which references the space race to get to the moon. Through his careful selection of images like these, he emphasizes American technological advancements and also the materialistic nature of the American culture, and critiques Britain's fascination with those things. In terms of pop art and its effect on popular culture, pop art is antisocial, but not anti-cultural in the sense that the Dada movement was. It is an artistic program of total rejection of the values of the so-called establishment. It is typical of pop art to condense a complex scene into its more characteristic elements. An example of this would be Degas' Absinthe. It is a painting of a cafe scene which often represents the unhealthy effects of absinthe, which happened to be a serious social dilemma at the time period. The title, which is simply Absinthe, focuses on the drink beyond the essential element of this work of art. It causes the two people in the painting to feel loneliness and isolation, which is what Degas' inspiration for the scene was. This painting was highlighting a social drinking problem that was an ongoing issue during this time period. It is the goal of pop art to transform the image of the American economy into uncertain and intriguing forms. Glass of Absinthe by Pablo Picasso is akin to Degas' Absinthe, using the symbolism of the absinthe to represent the well-known dangers of drinking in the culture of that time period. Pop artists tend to have a few basic themes that dominate their work, which are food and drink, objects of mass consumption such as cigarettes and alcohol, automobiles, and mechanical appliances, as well as patriotic symbols such as the American flag or the president's. It is because of these dominant themes and the use of popular brands and faces that pop art is relative to advertising. Pop art sets itself apart from other movements because of the emotional tone particular to it, discussed with a society penetrated by the ideological outlook and moral standards of a vastly expanded middle class. While the mood is not associated with any particular social class, it is imbued with the detachment of high society, which is a group whose hatred of hypocrisy is not matched by all except the underworld. Because of a general atmosphere of wit and irony, as well as a tendency towards the inversion and uncomplimentary transformation of familiar images, this leads to the conclusion that pop art, perhaps unintentionally, is sharply critical of contemporary American society. In the Cuspit reading, we learned that pop art takes images with wide circulation and thus so familiar that they seem commonplace and fetishizes them into icons by placing them into an art context. An example of this would be the use of a Coca-Cola bottle in Marisol's Love. The Coca-Cola bottle is a universal symbol of the American consumer economy because of America's love for soft drinks. The bottle is presented in an emphatic position while the supposed drinker is not to be seen. Pop art has comparative similarities to advertising because of its use of objects drawn from the communications network, such as the Coca-Cola bottle, and the physical environment of the city, such as the use of cafe scenes in artwork. In Nighthawks by Edward Hopper, we see a cafe scene that shows the artist's favoritism towards advertising and represents the American food service industry.
The man behind the curtain in this case is not Oz, but Andy Warhol, famed for his contribution to the pop art movement. Crow disputes this "what you see is what you get" idea perpetuated by the artist, instead dissecting and compartmentalizing him into three distinct persons. While most people would say they have their different sides to their personality, Crow contrasts and segments how it relates to his work, calling forth an examination of what Crow labels as the second Warhol, the persona that compelled his artistic endeavors, whether painting or film. This distinction is important because Warhol, number one, controlled his own publicity and directed the public away from the proverbial curtain with grand statements and pronouncements, especially about his work. It is the intentional duplicity and its importance in critiquing Warhol's work that Thomas Crow lays out in his essay, through an examination of early works, establishing first Warhol's intent on giving his own narrative. Warhol projected an air of disconnected and disinterested in regard to the content of his art, to the point of maintaining that his staff did most of the work and that he held that there was no meaning and that he did not have a point to make. However, Crow notes that within a year of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Warhol is throwing out statements that with no further examination one would miss the subversive nature of his words. Crow reports the American political ideology of affluence equals freedom and individualism is being challenged and transposed by Warhol. The propaganda of consumerism of the West being the ideal and leading American into a false sense of security is examined in Warhol's work. This idea of the pop art the icon of pop art having a message beyond simple consumerism, a message that separated the shiny advertised product for the mass consumption from reality and exposed the consequences of modern culture of consumerism is the argument Crow lays out. Popular film icon Marilyn Monroe committed suicide in 1962, and within weeks Warhol began his Marilyn diptych, which contradicts the arbitrary manner in which he claimed to work. Crow sees this work not as the mere statement of a female icon as product, but an inspection into the repeated imagery has a trace of memory in the technique of screen printing. Some areas are strong with color and crisp detail, like a memory. Others are more obscured. His treatment of other female icons like Elizabeth Taylor and Jackie Kennedy was an exploration into the strange connection with someone you have never met, like a celebrity, yet feel sympathy for. He notably explored the styles of women as well as held the images in a certain period of time. After the ubiquitous Campbell's soup can was established in 1963, Warhol began work with a different product in repetition. The tuna fish disasters utilized the repeated imagery of the product. However, it also repeated the headline and pictures of two women who died as the result of a contaminated tuna. Warhol uses the very symbol of American freedom, the automobile, as his discourse in the dangers of consumerism. Auto accidents, mangled cars. Warhol used gruesome photos of car crashes obtained from journalists who were unwilling to publish such terrible images. Again, using redundancy in the images that Crow feels is an escalation of awareness rather than a desensitizing the viewer. He carries this graphic and somber series that includes suicide, funerals, and also the electric chair as part of his disaster series. The idea of coming to a gallery to view art and happenings upon a style that had repeated news headlines and photos of traumatic events communicate what Kirsi Palamoki sees in the early stages of institutional critique, which was a downgrading of the viewing pleasure. The images were aesthetically hard and conjure up grief and discomfort. It is in this intentional, effective response to Warhol's work that Crow reveals a man behind the apathy curtain. Andy Warhol was not glorifying consumerism. He sought to speak the truth. He reclaimed the message in his work.
The institutional critique was a conceptual art movement which originated in the 1960s. It presented questions about the position of art institutions, specifically museums and galleries. Philosopher Arthur C. Danto and French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu initiated concepts such as the art world and the museum. Danto and Bourdieu both recognized that the art institution had established social and conceptual developments where the building or structure of a museum or gallery encompassed meaning in itself. The museum stands as an institution of scholarship, exhibiting artwork with the principle of educating the general public. So the material or structure of the museum is not just merely a white cube, but it is a historic structure which holds power to validate an artist and his work. These theories of art institutions set the groundwork for the critique of institutions. Despite some challenges, the importance of the museum as an academic institution has created, remain, and influence the artists and the works of art they create. Some of the artists that revealed the politics of art institutions were Hans Haacke, Michael Ascher, Marcel Brothars, and Daniel Buren. Artist Michael Ascher challenged the museum's influence and methods of selection. His artistic style was designing perceptive installations inside the museum's exhibition space, which disapprovingly examine the institutional outlining of art and the shift of the museum's right-angle structure of history. In the 1970s, Asher exhibited several of his installations, and along with artists Haka and Buren, essentially formed the institutional critique, which was an inquiry of material and socio-political conditions of contemporary artistic practice. Asher's exhibition included sensory and conceptual connections incorporating two areas and its happenings. This design could then be observed from the exhibition space, opening all of the gallery's area. There is also Asher's 1979 installation at the Art Institute of Chicago, which involved the removal of a permanent collection outdoor statue of George Washington and relocating it into the museum space. What Asher did may have been simple and straightforward, but what he created was a different experience by changing how the viewer aesthetically interpreted and valued the work of art. Asher was an artist who not only challenged the museum's right-angle views, but he also collaborated with the Art Institute of Chicago for this exhibition. He exercised his modern artistic ideas and embraced them with the museum's 18th century paintings and permanent furniture collection in a manner of providing a history to the public. Artist Marcel Brothars was direct in his ridicule of the structure and role of the museum. Brothars created work like Museum of Modern Art, acknowledging the importance of the relationship between the museum label and the object it describes. Brothars challenged and disagreed with the museum labeling and use of written words. His exhibition, which took place originally in his home, consisted of performances and crates placed throughout the space, which makes one doubt the methods of the museum as an institution. Artist Hans Haka, like Buren and Asher, believed that the spectator should complete the work. This idea separated the viewer's connection with the museum or gallery. The institutional critique invited the spectator to distinguish between the particular influences of art museums and the distinct social circumstances, forcing the audience to immerse in the work of art. This engagement within the framework of the museum was a must for the spectatorial agency following social change. Buren's 1970s institutional critique visually outlined, underlined, and disregarded the art institutions. Buren intended for the viewers to avoid the rules of the art museum and stay neutral towards his art, and in doing so they would be free, clear, and mature. A clear eye will recognize what is meant by freedom in art. The institutional critique became a tool in better understanding the structure and processes of working in the arts between art institutions and artists.